Again, thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon for the Keys to Scaling webinar. My name is John McFarland, and along with my colleague, Robert Satterwhite, we will run as moderators for the panel discussion this afternoon. Scaling and growing and maturing a business is and are significant milestones that many organizations aspire to achieve. It's a common misconception, though, that to successfully scale a business, it really takes an experienced CEO at the helm from the start. Reality often suggests, though, that successfully scaling has more to do with readiness, purpose, and a specific set of required leadership skills that often shift as companies and organizations grow and mature. Robert Satterwhite and I are so very fortunate to be joined this afternoon by an incredible panel that brings a wealth of experience in both leadership and business scaling, going from bootstrap startups to public and private companies. And we're so appreciative of their time and willingness to share their perspectives this afternoon. By way of format, we will be posing a few questions to each panelist this afternoon, and we'll follow up at the end of total remarks with time for all participants to pose questions as they see fit, using the question and answer function below. With that said, Robert and I will go ahead and jump right in and introduce our esteemed panel this afternoon. Robert?
Thank you, John. So Jeff Ward is currently CEO of Guardian Fall, who is the largest independent provider of height safety products and services. He also serves as a non-executive director of the British Safety Industry Federation. Prior to that, Jeff was the CEO of Centurion Safety Products, which design and manufacture above-the-neck safety equipment. Before that, he was a senior general manager at Britax Child Safety, Storch, Spirit Group, and Newell Brands. I hope I pronounced those right, Jeff. Jeff has spent 20 years in industrial and consumer durables and has worked and lived in the US, UK, and Germany. Jason Osterhage has been the president and CEO of Everwise Credit Union since March of 2022. Over his career, he has accumulated broad senior leadership experience in financial services at several large and progressive cooperative banking institutions, including Delta Community Credit Union in Atlanta and Alliant Credit Union in Chicago, in which for both institutions, he served as the chief lending officer. Before joining Everwise, he served as the chief operating officer at TDECU in Houston.
And Jessica Deckinger, last but certainly not least, is the founder and CEO of Mint Marketing, a global marketing operating firm. And she's also an operating partner at Clearhaven Partners private equity firm. Prior, she spent several decades in leadership roles at leading companies across the country, including Everbridge, Humana, Wolverine Worldwide, Penn Brands, which includes Welch's Fruit Snacks, and Avon Products. Jessica has also been an executive leader for 3 startups, and with successful exits, I might add, and has held a number of finance and operations roles at both JP Morgan and the National Football League earlier in her career. Thank you, Jessica, for joining us this afternoon. Well, with that, Jessica, certainly you were last to be introduced, but not least of the panel. I'd love to start and pose the first question with you. You've really been fortunate to see what right looks like leadership-wise in very large, complex public companies, all the way over to bootstrap startups. While certain leadership skills are needed through different life cycle pieces of the scaling business, in your opinion, are there a few common thematic leadership skills that run across all scaling businesses?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. I'm grateful to be on this panel with some pretty phenomenal executives and with you as well. So, I think in the early stages, I mean, it depends what stage you're at, but in the early stages of a business, when you're trying to scale, you need to have leadership, not necessarily that are deep, experienced, supercharged, 9-time executive leaders who are really hard for the business to hold, financially, compensation wise. I think you have to have folks who are hungry, driven, and I like to call them multi-sport athletes, people who are willing to play in a variety of arenas and dive in and make things happen, and who are, I mean, frankly, I think the skill sets of a variety of different leadership roles require a player coach mentality in those early days. You have to be able to pivot very rapidly between strategic thinking and the doing of it. And I think a lot of early stage companies, when they go to hire their first executives, oftentimes struggle with that because they find people who are either super seasoned and just want to sit and pontificate, or not visionary thinkers who can really be strategic, but are willing to do the work. And that balance, I think striking that amongst a leadership team in a scaling organization is critical. And having people who I think, frankly, have proven at early stages of their career that they can learn on a steep curve quickly is critical too, because then even if they're not an athlete in every sport across the business, they know that they have the aptitude and the capacity to learn quickly, pivot quickly, and again, just kind of fly between those player and coach roles across an organization that's going to have some gaps in those scaling times, in which itself may need to pivot, and they need to show that they have that flexibility to learn on the fly. I think a lot of scaling, and I'm sure our other amazing panelists will echo this, is the flexibility to adjust and adapt as you're finding product market fit and, testing addressable markets and figuring out your, structure of your organization. And so that capability to learn and scale and pivot are critical.
Jason, you were nodding there. I'm just curious what's going through your head when you hear what Jessica says.
Well, I agree with everything that Jessica said, and I would maybe emphasize a couple of points. One is this ability to learn and teachability, which I think requires like a humble curiosity. So if you're looking for a foundational skill, someone who can be curious, ask questions in a truly humble way. And then this last point that she just made about adaptability, I think requires real mental toughness and intellectual honesty. So that would be another like really foundational skill that leaders need all the way across the scaling curve, is to be able to look at the facts of reality and say, oh, like this is not working anymore. And I'm honest about that, can be honest with others. And that can hurt a little bit, to kind of, so the mental toughness piece, just having the courage to face those things and then adjust.
Jeff, anything to add, just out of curiosity, or to build on?
No, a lot of my experiences with this topic has been in the delegation, particularly in delegation, Robert, where that agility of what you decide to do for yourself and what you decide to give to others, because you have to be close enough to the sun to understand those problems as you and issues and opportunities as you make those decisions. So just building off the agility and particularly how you have to start thinking about what you do yourself and what you may give to others.
Got it.
Jessica, as a quick follow-up to that, and as Jason and Jeff noted, one of the key words you note is pivot and being hungry and driven. And a key word, pivot specifically, and I'm curious, is there a critical point in your opinion where a company has to pivot dramatically when it comes to increasing leadership skills, or harboring those are the right ones to continue to scale the business effectively?
Most definitely. I think, upskilling your leadership team as you grow is critical, and being able to recognize as a CEO, I'm sure that, everyone else here will echo this, being able to recognize when your talent has kind of maxed out their capacity within their current function, and then managing that change is critical to your success, because inevitably it's a tough thing when someone's, really great at scaling from 5 to 10 million or 10 to 20 or 20 to 100, but then they max out and they're kind of like, that's not their sweet spot anymore. And being able to recognize who is able to kind of punch through that brick wall you hit and who isn't is pretty important as an executive, frankly, in every area of the business, because you need to be able to right size the talent to the demands of the role and the expectations around what's needed to scale beyond. And while I love to think that everyone can do every job, it's not a reality. I mean, there are definitely unique skill sets required for each scale stage of a business. When you're going public, you need someone typically who's either been through that process, either as a leader who's up and coming or who's led it themselves, because it's complicated. If you're exiting to a private equity, same thing. If you're trying to take on new product lines, you need to manage multiple product or service lines. That's also a skill set that maybe someone who, when you had one thing, found it easy, and when you have multiple things, may not. And so figuring out, what those moments are. And I think the best change management process around that and finding the right executive is around really I think what was, said earlier by Jason, which is just that humble transparency as a leader, really just being open and honest around where you are, where the challenges are, how you want to support people's career growth as you bring in more executive leaders that have those skills as you scale. I think that's critical to managing the relationships and having seamless transition points.
Yeah. If I could build on that. So Jeff and Jason, I know you've both scaled businesses in your careers, grown businesses. And if we think about sort of that pivot, that tipping point in the growth life cycle where you had to adapt and wear a wildly different leadership hat. Curious, Jeff, maybe start with you. Just, how did you become aware of that need, and looking back, lessons learned, maybe what you might have done differently with that, with your new wisdom?
Sure. I guess so there's a book I came across, Early Career, Dr. Aziz. It's Managing Corporate Life Cycles, and I like it's 10 steps, and the third one is kind of go-go, which is, the owner founder-led business is managing a lot of fast growth. And many of my experiences, the last few, including this one, which is a little bit different, where it's 5 go-go's coming together. You go into adolescence, and that's the stage before number 5, which is the prime. And this adolescence is really this decentralization of power. I mentioned the empowerment and decision making. And that's where a lot of my pivots have been. They could be, somewhere between 50 and 200 million in revenue, to give context. But I've experienced a lot of those where I was either succeeding or coming in where is a crisis of autonomy of sorts, where the owner has been there for 20 plus years, or the leader of that particular group or function, and starting to really work with teams to decentralize decisions. And that pivot for me, the way I try and inspire myself and hopefully others through that is, imagine we could make 10 or 15 decisions, and now imagine we can make 100, and even if 9 out of 10 of those are only correct, that's what it's going to take now for us to really scale and take that next level. It's usually right around there. You're a recognized brand. You have 20 to 30% maybe share. What do you do now? And that's been my most common experience. And so perhaps you mentioned learnings. I mean, it was really applying a lot of situational leadership. So have you done this before? A lot of people like the sound of empowerment until sometimes it happens. and my experiences with the situational leadership, you could really make sure. And I would be even more direct and quick and clear in saying, you know, it is likely you'll be doing some things now that are actually your job that might have not been before. And you know, for a little while you need to kind of doctor-patient relationship with the team, and let's make sure we both crash the boards, to use a sports analogy, or follow the bits if you're playing football in England. But those are kind of it's real important that I think the whole team understand that.
Before I kick it over to Jason, I'm just curious, did that awareness, was that self-driven, or did you get feedback and recognize that you needed to lead differently? Because it could come from multiple spots.
Yeah,
right?
both.
Okay.
I think it's always both, but I've been very fortunate to have mentors I've worked with. I've almost always had coaching, which is important, but I've also been lucky to have you know, teams or individuals that will go and work with me at the next place, and where their feedback, you know, I could adjust to that, and make sure that we're learning new things together.
Right. Jason, what about you when you had to put on a different leadership hat, sort of recognizing that? What did that look like for you?
Well, I think about two different pivots. One would be a pivot of kind or quality, and these are where maybe you have to shift to a whole new business model, or what was mentioned before, a whole new function. Let's say you're going to go public, for example, and you've not had to do that before, or you've reached a scale that requires introduction. In my business, say banking, you reach a certain scale where you have to install a much more formal enterprise risk management function and work with the new regulator. That's pretty obvious, right? I think, you know, that pivot of kind now is a different type of business, and that really shows up in a way I think everyone can understand. The harder ones are what I think Jeff just talked through, where you're scaling up and it's, you know, a quantity thing, right? We're the same business, we're just a lot bigger. And but you do cross these milestones where you become larger enough that it is a change of kind. You're a new kind of business because you become a much bigger business. So how do you recognize? It can sneak up on you, right? I really like Jeff's comments about having a framework, being able to recognize the life cycles, and having some rules of thumb. You know, Jeff's got some clear experience. I've seen this before. I've seen that before. Hey, I think it's coming. And I would just add to that, you know, talking about it as a team, right? Sort of getting everyone together to say, hey, we're all perceiving different parts of this business. What's not working here? Where are we starting to see some friction develop? You know, is it friction that's making it harder for the right things to get done? Or you know, do we need to put some friction into a place to make it harder for the wrong things to get done? You know, once all of those questions start to have the wrong answers, then it's time to, I think, rethink things.
Any lessons learned? Looking back, go, oh, I wish I'd done it differently, or
well, I think maybe implicit to what I was saying is it does sneak up on you. So assume that it's happening before you notice, and try to move quicker, right, on changing the way you're operating in the business, and sense that sooner. And maybe the other thing I would say is back to Jeff's delegation comment. As you're scaling a business, it really is about managing at both the team and the player level, I think. So, and it's the ensemble. So maybe it's okay to have a few leaders in the organization that are ahead of where you are in the business, and some that are a little bit behind. That group can sit together and think, well, really, where are we? And some might see the future coming before others. So that might be a lesson, is just stock the squad with folks who have seen, you know, where you're going and are comfortable with where you've been.
Before, I know we have another question for Jessica, but one question that popped up, Jeff, was the name of the book that you referenced. If you could say that again for the audience.
The author was Dr. Adiz, Adizes. The first name is hard to pronounce, but he has several. And this 10-step model, I think you could then find, I think it was Managing Corporate Life Cycles.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Over to you, John.
No, certainly. Thanks, Robert. And Jessica, right back to you. It seems like a big circle here where this is all connecting, but you're a founder of your own firm. You're an experienced operating partner, and so you're advising and consulting with scaling businesses every single day. Are are there some pain points that challenges that you're consistently, really working with and advising some of these growing businesses on? And if so, what are they?
I mean, it's probably different for me than for Jason and Jeff, because I am a CEO now, but I was a marketer for many, many years functionally in-house. So the scale, a lot of times the front end of scaling falls on the marketer. Like, where's the business? Where's it coming from? Where are the opportunities coming from? Right. And so I focus in my operating role as in that specialty, kind of looking at the formulaic approach to scaling in software. And I think there are consistent challenges across lots of businesses. I think the size of companies I work with, typically one of the challenges they have is, and in this market in particular, something I'm seeing at all sizes of businesses, is that there is a lot of pressure. There's a lot of monetary pressures, not a lot of free flowing, inexpensive cash. Businesses have to grow faster with less people and less budget. And particularly in the side of the business that I work on in the marketing end, that creates a lot of pressure up front, because a little bit what you put in is what you get out. A lot of what you put in is what you get out. And so I think, honestly, the do more with less model is really what folks have to focus on. And that's a common pain point that everyone's figuring out right now, is like the expectation of our investors, the expectation of our executives is that we're going to continue the way we did in 2020 and 2021, when we had lots of cash and lots of people. And, now we have half of that or less. And so the pain point I'm seeing is that executives have to be able to flex that way too. Like, they have to be able to think nimbly, to leverage the tools that are now available, AI in new ways, right, to empower you to do things you couldn't do before, to be able to think on the fly. And that pivot's tough. And I think that's something a lot of, I'm seeing a lot of, and what I'm coaching a lot of people on, is how to flex. It happens that there's a point in your career where you're at a certain age that I won't name. I don't want to call out my gray hair, but where you've seen it, you've been through a lot of cycles, and so you can flex that way. But again, that's the balance between, at what stage do you want someone who's that seasoned, who maybe is going to want to be pontificating and ideating and not doing. And so finding that balance of someone who has enough seasoning across, I guess there was a really poignant point that Jeff made around having the right person who's been through something, and then Jason enhanced with someone who's seen what's coming ahead because they've been through it, right? I think there's something to that, and that's what I'm coaching a lot of these businesses on, is how to see what is going to come ahead. And I try to be a coach in that, but I think, frankly, it's a challenge for all businesses right now.
Yeah, for sure. Jeff and Jason, this idea of surrounding yourself with a strong team is a theme that has come up in this conversation, and I know through working with both of you, assessing the team skills and capabilities, not just in what they're doing now, but the future requirements of the job. And I'm just curious to know, to what extent have assessments helped you, hindered you, to sort of highlight leadership skills, competencies, gaps relative to that sort of unknown future? Jason, let's start with you.
Well, I think they're very helpful, and it's critical to give you a starting point for what's sort of the raw material of the leader you're working with, right? You can think about their psycho-emotional makeup, their character, and we're not talking about a inescapable frame that well, this is who the person is and they can never be anything else. So I think it's an important starting point, right? And then from there, you can really engage in a relationship and a dialogue with the leader. And that can help you see what their capacity is beyond where they are today, right? Which is a critical question we're dancing around in this conversation is, if you're scaling your business, are you going to be able to scale with the leaders you have, or when are you going to trade them out? And do you always have to trade them out, or can some grow with the business? And clearly the answer is going to be a bit of both, but how do you know, right? And so I would say that the assessment piece is critical, understanding how it's a tool that can be used. One of the mistakes I think that can be made, easy to say, there's one on either end of the spectrum. One is putting too much stock in the assessment and thinking, well, I'm just going to manage by this psychometric and what's the score here, and let all of those statistics do the thinking for me, or that I'm going to throw it all out as hogwash, right? And it doesn't really make any sense. So no, start with it, take it seriously, but then build from there, relationship and conversation with the leader.
Okay, so collecting evidence just to see what that unique leadership profile looks like, which could come from a lot of different points of view. Jeff, what about you?
Yeah, I like I like them very much. I do for current and potential leaders, and almost all my last several teams will be doing either DISC or ColorWorks or CME profiles to understand how to work with each other, and all can do slightly different things as specific assessment tools. The idea of assessments on some of the new talent you might bring, which is something I valued a lot in actually working with Odgers on, is I like what Jason was saying, that the answer is, do you change everyone out or bring in new people? And the answer is a bit of both. If we take that as the foundation, which I totally agree with, it actually means the ones you're bringing in, you have to make sure those work. So, because that's gonna be part of the important shift, and bring some of the new ideas. So exactly what Jason said, this idea, and what I think Odgers has helped me with a lot, is this idea of current and future. So the better your assessing partner understands your business, and you invest that time in helping that, either whether that be through multiple team members or a few visits, that they really understand your business and where you're trying to scale to and what some of the challenges are. I think the easier they'll help you also answer some of the future, the current and future question. And that's been a real insight for me through the kind of more upfront assessments. And then once your team's established, I love what Jason said a little while ago, which was, you got to do the individual kind of coaching and assessment and team discuss, but also as a team. So I'm a big fan of, I've just recently put in a team coach for our top 25 executives, that we experience the things together. Maybe for a third of the team, they're not new concepts or models, but by experiencing them together and kind of sharing some common language, you get there a bit quicker, and it's about shared experiences too.
Yeah. One of the questions in the comments was about agility and how to measure it. I'm just curious, and that's come up, sort of pivoting, flexibility. How do you look for that? Open question to the panel. Sort of what kinds of things are you looking for? I mean, I know how we do it, but I'm just curious, what are you looking for?
I mean, I'll
Anyone?
start there. For me, in the interview process, I think like an assessment is great, and it's a great indicator of team fit, maybe capacity for, mental toughness, all those things. I think the challenge that I always have with that is in isolation, it's not enough. The way I assess for pivot capabilities is based on case study material presentation. I think, like, I know that's a tough thing because a lot of people are like, oh, don't make me give you the work before I get the job. But I think there is a methodology around asking tough questions, presenting scenarios, asking for someone's critical thinking capabilities, and seeing how creatively they problem solve. And you can do that without having them give away the whole shop for free. But I think it's critical in interview process and assessing talent and leadership that they do some, demonstrative work. I think otherwise you can't get a sense of how they're going to operate, both hard skills and soft skills combined. And I think that for me, that's the combined, formula for figuring out their capability for not just agility, but for critical thinking, experience level, you know, all the things you want to assess for your team, and also where you're going to fill gaps, which I think, frankly, when you design case studies, I never use the same one for every role. What I typically do is look at the entire executive team, look at where my holes are, hard skills, soft skills, style, all those things. And we design the case study, you know, conversations part of the interview process around what's missing, knowing that you have to have a holistic, you can't just have individual strong players. You have to have a team that fits and complements each other.
Okay. Fantastic. Jeff, Jason, anything to add to that?
I'll just jump in and say I really like this idea. If you're selecting someone to join the team, haven't worked with them before, what I hear Jessica talking about is what I call relevant work samples. Right. So if you're hiring a graphic designer, that's pretty easy. Bring your portfolio. But I think you can do the same thing with leaders, you know, and it is a case type of conversation. Set a case or require someone to bring past cases that demonstrate a very specific kind of style. So for sure, relevant work samples. And then I guess I would just go back and say, for me, maybe I'm repeating myself, but it really is the psycho-emotional raw material of the leader. So if the question is, all right, on the team, is this a leader that can scale with the organization, or is this a leader that I'm going to have to think about trading out? I'm going to need to understand, do they have the ability to grow and outgrow the business, right? Grow faster than the business. And so what kind of psycho-emotional makeup and character do they have that can enable that type of continuous development and remaking of themselves as a leader? So just looking into those questions. And I do want to emphasize the social piece of it, right? I mean, I think or leaders, teams, they scale together. And so you might think about, how can the team scale together and how can leaders help each other do that? And what is the chemistry and compatibility between the team? You might have a leader that on their own as a solo operator maybe wouldn't be able to scale with the business, but with their peers and colleagues, it all works and they can grow.
Jeff, anything to add?
Yeah, I like what Jessica and Jason are saying about work samples. I think if agility is kind of identified as something that is going to be important to the scaling project, if you will, then I think actually asking for making your brief that specific is quite key. I just went through an exercise with a few of my team members that was pretty cool on agility just recently, which is Gallup actually does an excellent job with agility, and you know, that's one of their kind of big research areas. And I like some of their way because it's about the strengths and focusing on your strengths rather than, you know, playing to your weakness. And actually, we did an exercise where we just, you know, it gives you your top 5 out of 34 strengths, and you then can sit with the team and say, well, how do these strengths help specifically agility, and how do these strengths perhaps maybe hinder or prevent agility? And there was kind of the common misconception that agility is coming from those that will have, you know, strategic or achievers in their top 5, but you also need people to check against risk and do some of those things too, if you're going to really kind of embrace the agile team concept. And so, like Jason's saying, you got to go together as a team, and the social aspect. And so just those simple little exercises, which is another version of an assessment, I guess, right, brings you those things.
Yeah. So one of the themes I'm hearing is agility is multifaceted. And that's the way we look at it, sort of intellectual dexterity, interpersonal savvy, growth proficiency. And the way I think about it is, how many levers can you pull in the face of complexity, ambiguity, novelty? And the more you can pull, the more agile. So a lot of leaders, let's pick on finance, they're really good on intellectual dexterity, but that's it. You know what I mean? All the other indices are low. So developing them, sort of raising their awareness and then developing them to lead better through and with people, or to be better cheerleaders, sort of rounding out that agility can be really helpful, I think.
Yeah, what I hear you saying there is scaling up well requires multiple types of intelligence, right? So you're talking about obviously intellectual intelligence, and then there's social intelligence and emotional
Right.
intelligence and group intelligence. And,
Right.
how are all of those individual leaders building up their intelligence on those dimensions? And then you're looking at the collective intelligence of the group. I think that's definitely a key takeaway.
Right on. Right on. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, talk about the board, because a lot of new CEOs, they'll come in and suddenly they've got to manage up. And I'm just curious what you've seen and what you've dealt with. What approaches have you found to be least and most effective, particularly in this context of evolving and scaling in dealing with the board? Anyone want to go first on that?
I'm both a board member and have been a CMO of a public company.
Okay.
And in both functions, I found that, I mean, I think you have to be authentic to your style, but for me, radical transparency was rapid radical transparency, and pivoting and ideation are the key to success with the board. You have to tell them, know what's not working, tell them what's not working, tell them what is, but really spend time with, I think honest solutioning, and if they're a strategic board, they will have ideas for you about how to strategically solution if you're open about what's going on. I think when you start to try to hand wave around tough topics, or don't really deeply understand your business, I think this was a great point that Jeff made around, you have to be enough in the game that you really know, in a board setting, because there's governance and there's responsibility of the board. You have to make sure that you know what you're talking about. If you do, and you can come in and be upfront and have, a collaborative discussion where you're providing constructive solutions to the things you've shared that are challenges, then it's really a great collaborative partnership if you have the right board members. I mean, I think if you have a really tough board, that can be a different dynamic, but if you have a strategic board and they're smart people, which they usually are, and they want the business to succeed and you want the business to succeed, it should be that kind of partnership, and you don't want them granularly in the weeds. So you have to come with solutions to your own problems so that you're not asking them to like helicopter into your actual role, right? But provide strategic thought and direction. And so there's a managing up process there, a skill set as an executive managing up, so that you're keeping the board strategic and not, and especially if they're practitioners. Now that I'm on a board and I've been a CMO, I very carefully walk that line of not telling the marketer, well, you should run this, Google campaign. I try not to get in there, and I think it's tough. And so I actually cultivate a mentoring relationship with the marketers in the organizations where I'm on the board, because I want them to manage me out of the weeds. And that's a skill set they'll learn. And I think it's something I learned, but hard knocks version of learning it. And I want to pass that on as my deed forward. But I think that's my take on board management, is that you have to kind of understand board role, understand board potential value, and manage that.
Yeah, and I want to agree with that point about the sort of nuanced skill it's required to lead the board as they lead you, right? And my role as CEO over the last couple of years, that's been a very interesting challenge, that it makes the CEO role so much different than any other role. And I think a good top team can help the CEO do that. So it really isn't about just the CEO, but the really important point Jessica's making about you have to lead the board and for them to lead you. Two other things I would add. One is slow is smooth and the board. If you boards tend to change last sometimes, right? Leadership changes, strategy changes, business changes, and the board is changing. So if you can get out in front of that, if you can help the board begin to change before they feel like they have to, that's probably good for a scaling business. And then I'm about to contradict myself and say, if you run, maybe not, maybe it's just a way of looking at the same topic, but if you outrun your board, if you get too far ahead of your board, then you're in big trouble, right? So how do you pace the business with the board, move the board with the business, And in balancing all of that is really the challenge.
Jeff, anything to add?
Yes, I think what both Jessica and Jason are saying about lead the board to lead you is spot on, and not kind of just coming with problems, because that's not only does that make a more effective working relationship, but you get more out of them that way. Because I sometimes see it as pressure testing thought, rather than, otherwise it's kind of like Jessica described, well, what am I supposed to do now? You kind of try and figure out the options and do the job. So it's a balance of how you present those. So my kind of, some of my go-tos is, not, definitely present the problems, and ideally with some options and remedies. Be clear whether you're asking for thought or approval. Sometimes because the board is distance, what I find helps a lot too, just to bring things to life, is send real, forward real emails, or send real photos from the colleagues, employees, staff, to kind of accentuate the point. So it's not always you delivering the message, but the seeing that what you're saying resonates in some other ways, or people are feeling or seeing it. It's funny because Q&As or frequently asked questions is such a basic communication tool, but it's often so helpful whatever direction you're communicating. I just always think of, I'll send you the Q&As with it, because I know what you're going to ask, because I would ask the same thing.
Well, I love that example.
Anticipating it,
I
right?
love that example as a practical way to lead the board to lead you, because I know you're going to ask these questions, but you can also put in a few questions they wouldn't think to ask, but they should. And that's a super elegant way to say, no, this is the question you should be asking. Or, make sure all of the more tactical operational approaches like Jessica was talking about, you don't include any of those, and you're teaching the board, no, you govern at this level, you manage at this level, with this sort of subtle curation of the questions. So a really awesome practical example of how you can lead the board to lead you by priming them with the questions.
I like that. One of the questions just come in, while scaling up, how are you taking into consideration ESG and diverse leadership? Thoughts?
One thing that comes to mind for me is often the challenge you have with making leadership more diverse is the pipeline of competitive candidates. And so if you do have the opportunity to scale a business, really look for diverse leaders that have the potential to scale with you, and then they can grow up into those roles, right? It's a way to go back up the pipeline, right? Find maybe junior leaders full of potential, bring them in early in the business, and they can grow with the business.
Great. Anything to add? Jeff, Jessica?
I work in global roles. I always have. So I think really also just thinking about that representation, cultural IQ, linguistic IQ, as factors in cultural diversity and linguistic diversity to represent the multiple customer bases, or retail locations or offices you have, I think is critical too. So I try to build a pipeline of folks who represent our target markets, not just how we look or who our backgrounds. If we're from the same place and speak the same language, we don't represent our customer base when you're a global organization. So I take those into account as we're thinking about building bench talent as well. I agree with what Jason said. It's just critical to build bench talent. You have to do it early, and you have to cultivate them, to be recognized when they're strong and give them opportunities. So you're really building that succession plan of folks who can step into those roles.
You mentioned culture, and one of the questions from the audience is, what role does company culture play in successful scaling, and how can leaders foster a culture that supports that growth and adaptability? Sometimes culture can be a drag on the need to change because people hate to change. They're comfortable in the status quo. how do you sort of take advantage of that and recognize it to help support the change? Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I define culture as the way we do things around here, as just a kind of a quick comment. And I guess what I try and do, especially in this adolescence phase, is get everybody to help. Let's kind of also define the culture, or set the culture a little bit together. And you need to kind of sit with teams and say, what are some of our mantras, or what are some of the rules that we want to embrace together, as a team. And I think if you start with those and try and keep them simple and start building and adding from there, it's great. We have a few right now in the 30-person team we're building and scaling right now, which is kind of, talk to me, not about me, be in the room. And just little things like that, where, everybody's asked to put their phone down. We're going to talk about us for the next 60 minutes or 90 minutes, and what's working for us or not working for us. I think as long as you can force that in the calendar, I'm forcing that in every month, that you'll actually kind of, it's okay not to feel you can control the culture yourself. You've got to, and the more committees and people that can attack a certain part of it and have fun with it, the better is my perspective.
Jessica, Jason, thoughts on culture?
I also think it's got to be deliberate, to the point that Jeff just made. It has to be deliberate. You have to not just encourage groups of partners in the process of developing a culture, because I think there's a lot of soft skills that go in, which I think are actually the hard skills anyway. Really, there's a lot of soft skills into culture. It's not just behavioral things like put your phone away. It's also, are you listening to people actively or listening to respond? Do you enable really productive meeting time, but also respect that some people have things they need to say and maybe need to run over 5 minutes? Like, what are the rules of the road about how you play in the soft skills arenas and the hard skill arenas? Are pretty critical. And I again, like, I'm a radical transparency person, so I tend to lead through aggressive kindness and listening, and radical transparency about what I'm thinking, and then ask for the same from my teams. And that's worked well for me. But I think as a leader, really defining culture isn't just about you. It's about really that active listening part of what needs to be accomplished in order for the team to function together, particularly when you're talking, geographically dispersed organizations that are representing global, teams and things like that. I think you have to really be aware and, understand not just global culture, but local culture, right? Like, what's happening in your local markets that might be different than what's happening where you are, perspectives. And that requires really active listening as a part of the, a norm of culture for me, which is a soft skill, but frankly, the hardest thing to master.
And are you your radical, what did you call it? Aggressive kindness?
Aggressive kindness and radical transparency.
Are you calling it out when people aren't following the norms? I mean, how aggressive are we talking about here?
I think when I was in larger organizations, it was harder to steer that because I wasn't the head of the ship. Now I'm the head of the ship. I run my own company, right? So I don't want to work in an environment where kindness isn't the norm, right? I want people to start from a place of assuming good intent, and output is good intent. And that to me is kindness. And so that requires that you actually cultivate in people, a really active participation in kind behaviors to each other, and active listening is a part of that. And we talk about it in the training in the orientation and training of my company about what that means. And we practice it with the team, like, hey, call people out on this if they're not doing it. Because I think it can happen, and especially in experienced executive teams where people think they know the answer. And if you want to build a deliberate culture where you have folks who are, practicing that kind of culture, you have to be willing and open to do that radical thing where you call people out and say, like, hey, look, I really appreciate you have something to say. It sounds like it's important to you, but also you cut this person off. Let's listen to what the other person had to say first, and then, give it a second to absorb and respond.
And well, to tie all these comments together, I did exactly as we're describing here with this team I'm leading. Came into the organization a couple years ago, and we are really refounding the business, transforming and scaling it. And we rebranded the business about 9 months ago. first time in 92 years, and we've got a new brand. And so we took that opportunity to redesign the culture. And just like Jeff described, we sat together as a team and drafted what we call the Culture and Leadership Constitution. And we wrote it down, and we all sort of co-authored it. And we do hold each other accountable. Some of us are a little bit better than others at quoting it, word for word, but really everyone is kind of saying, oh, hey, we committed to do this, or that was an example where we didn't really follow through on that. And, there's some sound bites from this document that circulate around. So I think you really can hold each other accountable and call each other out. And we do have some phrases, kind of like this aggressive kindness idea, these brain tickler phrases that stick with you and make people think differently. And I think that's a powerful way to do it. And then the last thing I would say about culture is, for me, it's been helpful to identify a few of the high leverage things that really change culture. I think we're talking about leadership here all throughout this conversation. Organizations are shadows of their leaders. So, the highest level leaders cast the longest shadow, and who those people are and how they show up creates culture. And so just talk about that with your team and make those choices. And relatedly, who you invite into the organization and who you invite to leave the organization sends a massive cultural signal. And also who rises up in the organization. I've had conversations with my team. There's individuals they want to grow, and say, look, what cultural message would I be sending if we promote this individual? Are you asking that question? Right? We're picking winners, and people start to model themselves on the winners. So what are these like simple choices that you can make that really communicate culture? And then the last thing I would say is, shaping culture is going to cost you, right? So where are those moments where it's a very costly decision? For example, someone you really love working with, and you don't want to see them go, but they have to go because their presence creates a cultural price. Or you really need to fill a role, and there's like a B+ person, but they're bad for the culture, and it just takes you another 90 days to find the right talent, and that can be super expensive. But you pay that price because culture is that important. So people notice that, and that's what creates culture.
I just want to say the brand part of what Jason said, I think, is also really key and interesting, because if that's the beauty of centering around the brand, is it's external and internal. So you're really maximizing the benefit of that. Your team is spending time talking about the brand, and it just makes sure it's authentic in and out, what values the brand has, and what your proof points are, and so on. Doing that exercise really together, I'd be a huge advocate of.
It's interesting. It's not, Jason, what you said, it's not just the decision you're making, it's the ripple effects, it's the implications, like what message does this send to the rest of the organization? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? The other thing, sort of that learning and development, another question from the audience about how can leaders foster an environment of continuous learning and development to ensure that employees and leaders are equipped to adapt. Sometimes, the executive team will just delegate that down to individual managers, and you do your own thing, which is not always the right way to do it. Other organizations have an L&D group within. I'm just curious what the different approaches are that you have used.
Well, I'll quickly jump in and say one of the ways you can create an environment that supports learning is, again, the top level leaders have to role model it and go first. So if the CEO and senior executives are not themselves growing and being transparent about that and showing how they are a work in progress and where do they need to get better, and not in some type of superficial way, but in a real sort of uncomfortable way, that's just super powerful, I think, for people to see it.
What do you mean by uncomfortable?
Well, I think we all can think of a time where there's been a leader that's maybe shared a story, but it's a cover story. It's like a little bit whitewashed. It's been, all the sharp edges have been rounded off. But I think it's better if you have leaders that are courageous and vulnerable to tell the real story and say, well, here's this thing that I did, or show up with their team and apologize for getting something wrong and really working on it again in a way that costs you. People are very tuned into authenticity. And so if you're growing in a way that is expensive to you, they see that you mean it.
I agree. I think vulnerability is key as a leader to an extent. If it's authentic to you, it's key to an extent. And I think one of the ways that's shown up for me in learning and development is I always have very junior reverse mentors. They coach me in topics that are, in a wide range of things they might be experts in. And I have loved that because I think, frankly, younger people know a lot more than we did when we were that age at this point, technologically, right? They're digital natives, all these things that you can learn from them. But I think it gives an opportunity for the organization to see that you're listening. And if you can be vulnerable and authentic with someone when they're reverse mentoring you, it opens the filter to sometimes tough feedback about culture, about all the things you're doing as a leader. And if you can be open to the fact that someone might have insight, who's not necessarily a contemporary, that can be a really valuable thing to the organization. It also can give voice to leaders that are young and an opportunity for them to get executive presence and, how to learn to talk to power. And so that in itself teaches that, you're willing to learn, they should be fighting to learn. It kind of passes the gift forward. I ask all of my executives on my team to do that. And that's tough for some people, but I think it's my weird tick about learning and development. I think you have to cast the longest shadow as someone who's open to grow, from all stages of career.
Well, you're role modeling for the entire organization, right? And everyone's watching, right? So that sends a really powerful, positive message on your willingness to be open and hear from other people. Jeff, what about you? What are you doing over at Guardian Fall around learning and development?
Yeah, so I think what's really key is showing everybody that you're doing it yourself, and learning is a lifelong process. And as long as if you exude that at every corner, everybody understands. I've been in some larger organizations where we could afford even specific learning and development functions or a person. And what I found with those to be successful is often kind of certain processes that are really important to our pivot or shift, be that a gated new product development process or how we do pricing here, things like that, which is actually delivered by one of the leaders themselves and kind of done that way. With kind of smaller more adolescent shifts, I found the best is again to embrace 2 or 3 and really hit a critical mass of the team and do them together. I just think if everybody breaks off and does some of them one-to-one, or what have you, I think people should do that on their own. But really, doing the experience together, I find in the debrief of that is where you get the shifts, where you've shared that learning and development power together, and 70% of it will feel the same for a lot of the team, or that learning, and we'll share real examples of what's going on. So anyway, that's where I sense the power is. So we're doing a few big kind of key things as a team per year as we go in this current situation.
I like those comments, and it makes me think maybe this is more relevant for established or large organizations, but it makes me think that human beings generally do love to learn. Like, we're built to learn. We're always learning. And so is there a way in organizations to normalize virtuous failure, right? Because learning really is all about getting it wrong to get it right. If you think about, you're always poking around and testing and trying things, and you're getting it wrong, and then that's how you get it right. And so is there a way to normalize virtuous failure? And it's several of my past leadership roles. That's just something I spend a lot of time talking about, and then finding conspicuous ways to make virtuous failure celebrated and okay. And we can all think about, Blameworthy failure is kind of obvious, right? If someone, if there's deviance or inattention, you know, someone breaks a rule and something bad happens, right? That's clearly a blameworthy failure. I mean, we can all think of a virtuous failure, right? Like hypothesis testing. All of our science is built on virtuous failure. We're going to form a null hypothesis. We're going to go test it. And if we get it wrong, that moves the field forward. And so that's virtuous failure. And then you can think about a lot of different types of virtuous failure in between those things, right? For example, you know, what if there's a big crisis and there's no rule book, and your leadership team, you know, tries to take a shot at figuring it out and it doesn't work perfectly? Well, maybe it didn't work perfectly, but we can praise the courage of folks for trying to act when they didn't have a playbook. So just opening up a conversation about what is blameworthy failure and how really little of it there is in organizational life, and what's virtuous failure, and how you can learn from that virtuous, praiseworthy failure.
I love that. I love that, Jason. And on that note, we're gonna sign off. I just want to thank Jessica, Jason, and Jeff for participating in this. Your wisdom has been very enlightening for us, for John and me, and for the audience, I'm sure. And have a great rest of your day. Any final word, John?
No, thank you all. This has been great. Your invaluable thoughts, perspectives, and wisdom. Take care.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.